Receiving a handwritten letter was, for many, the only acceptable way to communicate, both personally and professionally. In fact, this mindset made general acceptance of mechanical writing one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, as society believed that letters needed to be written out in neat longhand. In the late 1800s, our general response to a typewritten letter would have been something like our response to junk mail today. Others were concerned that typed signatures could be forged, and some recipients were angered and insulted, seeing a typed letter as a social comment on their inability to read handwriting. While the earliest known versions of the typewriter date back to the late 1500s, it was almost 300 years before anything resembling what we know as a typewriter today became a viable communications tool. Learn more about the history of the typewriter and take a look at 3 antique typewriters we have in the collection of the National Scouting Museum in this edition of Artifact of the Week. The development of the typewriter is much like the invention of other complex ideas or machines, like an automobile, the telephone, or the telegraph. No one person or idea can be clearly identified as the original and sole inventor, as over time improvements, changes, and even new technology helped the product evolve into what we know today. The earliest known typewriting style machine was created in 1575 by an Italian printmaker, Francesco Rampanzetto. His device was a machine that would impress letters onto paper. Fast forward to 1714, when Englishman Henry Mill obtained a patent in Britain for a machine that he hath by his great study and pains and expense invented and brought to perfection an artificial machine or method for impressing or transcribing of letters, one after another as in writing, whereby all writing whatsoever may be engrossed in paper or parchment, so neat and exact as not to be distinguished from print, that the said machine or method may be of great use in settlements and public records, the impression being deeper and more lasting than any other writing, and not to be erased or counterfeited without manifest discovery. Now, the historical record is unclear on whether he actually built a working model of his typewriter, but the patent protected his idea for the next 14 years. In 1802, Italian Agostino Fantoni invented a working model of the typewriter to help his blind sister communicate with friends. Then in 1806, another Italian, Pellegrino Turi, a nobleman and skilled mechanic, fell in love with a beautiful countess. Slowly, the Contessa's vision started to blur, distort, and fade. In an effort to improve her illegible writing and to enable her to correspond with him and her friends in private, he improved on the Fantoni typewriter. When the Countess pushed a key, an arm struck a piece of carbon paper, setting atop the regular paper and transferring the letters to the page. Now, as a side note, Turi is credited with inventing carbon paper, which for him was an ink supply for his typewriter. There's very little known about the actual machine that Turi created, but there are 16 letters written on it that have survived and are preserved in an Italian museum. An American, William Austin Burt, patented a machine called the typographer in 1829. While it has been called the first typewriter by some, the London Science Museum describes it merely as the first writing mechanism whose invention was documented, but even that can be disputed, as Fantoni and Turi's inventions predate it. Danish pastor Ramus Malling Hansen developed the world's first commercially produced typewriter in 1865 and patented and put it into production in 1870. The Hansen writing ball arranged the most frequently used letters to be pressed by the fastest written fingers, with the consonants on the right and the vowels on the left. This arrangement, along with the placement of the letters on short radial pistons, made the machine a very high-speed typing machine. The type is printed on a paper surface by means of a carbonized ribbon or paper. On the original model, the paper was attached to a cylinder which moved by the help of an electromagnetic battery, making the writing ball in principle the very first electric typewriter. The first commercially successful typewriter was invented in 1867 by Christopher Sholes, Frank Hall, Carlos Glidden, and Samuel Sewell from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Sholes eventually disowned the machine and refused to recommend it. Hall, Glidden, and Sewell sold their patent for $12,000. The buyers made an agreement with E. Remington & Sons, famous manufacturers of sewing machines, to commercialize the machine as the Sholes & Glidden typewriter. This also represents the origin of the term typewriter. In March 1873, Remington began production of its first typewriter at its factory in Ilion, New York. It had a QWERTY keyboard layout, which because of the machine's success was adopted by other typewriter manufacturers and became standard. The first Remington typewriters even came with a foot pedal, just like the sewing machine, to control carriage returns. As with most other early typewriters, the type bars strike upwards so the typist could not see the characters as they were being typed. Acceptance of the typewriter was slow initially. No one was certain who would want a typewriter, and it was thought clergymen and men of letters would be early adopters, with interest expanding to the general public. Then in the 1880s, the development and adoption of the concept of scientific management came about. Work became specialized, with some people doing correspondence, others keeping accounts, and other similar compartmentalized tasks. The typewriter at last found acceptance. Also, as business became so big and impersonal, people were ready to give up the old idea of business letters being governed by the same rules as personal correspondence. Additionally, adaptation was facilitated over the next several years by various improvements. In 1878, the Shift key made it possible to type both capital and lowercase letters with the same keys. The Shift key also allowed numbers and symbols to share type bars. Ultimately, this reduced the number of keys required and simplified the mechanical complexity of the typewriter. Another advancement was the development of front striking in 1880. In most of the early typewriters, the type bar struck upward against the paper, pressed against the bottom of the platen. The typist could not see the text as it was typed until a carriage return caused it to scroll into view. Visible typewriters used front striking, where the type bar struck forward against the front side of the platen, allowing the typist to see what they were typing. This quickly became the standard, as improvements in the mechanical design assured that with front striking typewriters, the type bars fell back into place reliably when the key was released. In 1893, the 4-bank keyboard became standard, and in 1897, the tab key, which facilitated typewriters' use in business settings, was added. Before using the tab key, the operator had to set mechanical tab stops, or pre-designed locations, to which the carriage would advance when the tab key was pressed. This allowed the typing of columns of numbers which aligned correctly. Index typewriters came on the scene in the 1880s as well. Now, an index typewriter uses a pointer or stylus to choose a letter from an index. The pointer is mechanically linked so that the letter chosen can then be printed, most often by the activation of a lever. The index typewriter was briefly popular in niche markets. Although they were slower than keyboard typewriters, they were mechanically simpler and lighter, therefore less expensive to produce. They were marketed to travelers as portable and as budget-friendly options for those who did not need to produce a large quantity of typewritten materials. The index typewriter soon lost its appeal as new keyboard typewriters became smaller, less expensive, and refurbished typewriters became available. Although pushed out of the market in most of the world by keyboard machines, successful Japanese and Chinese typewriters are the index type, albeit with a very much larger index and number of type elements. Embossing tape label makers are the most common index typewriters we have today, and perhaps the most common typewriters of any kind still being manufactured. By 1910, the keyboard typewriter had reached a somewhat standardized design. There were minor variations with one manufacturer to another, but most typewriters were mechanically identical and featured standard or elite type sizes, 10 or 12 characters per inch, dual-colored ribbons, commonly black and red ink, and double shift capabilities, allowing for even more characters in the same physical space. While there's an entire history to share about the development of electric typewriters, we're going to leave that for another time and look at 3 manual typewriters found in the collection of the National Scouting Museum. Our first typewriter is a Calligraph No. 2. Now, the Calligraph line was the second American typewriter to come on the market after the Scholes and Glidden and Remington typewriter we talked about earlier. It was manufactured by the American Writing Machine Company of New York. Now, like the Remington, the Calligraph is an understroke type bar typewriter. In this case, you must lift the carriage in order to see what you've just typed. The Calligraph No. 1, produced in 1880, types only in capital letters. The Calligraph No. 2 was manufactured in 1882 and types in both upper and lower case. The Calligraph's lowercase keys are the white keys and the uppercase keys are the black keys. This is an arrangement that would not make touch typing an easy activity. There are 2 space bars, one on either side, and it uses an ink ribbon to transfer the letters to the paper. The long extension in front of the keyboard is necessary to accommodate the typewriter's system of leverage and allow for less pressure to be applied to the keys. This particular typewriter was found by Philmont staff members at Cypher's mine. Now, a unique feature of the Calligraph No. 1 is that it has an underlined key, but no key for the letter Q. Our other two typewriters in the collection are both Oliver Typewriter Company Model No. 9s, and both were manufactured in their Woodstock, Illinois plant. Across a 30-year run from 1896 to 1926, the original Oliver Typewriter Company produced about a dozen different models of its unmistakable batwing typewriter. The Model No. 9 was the most produced model by the company, with over 400,000 units produced beginning in 1915. Interestingly, the small Chicago suburb of Woodstock, Illinois was home to both Oliver and the Woodstock Typewriter Company, and for a very brief period of time was known as the typewriter capital of the world, shipping out 50% of the industry's new machines annually. The Oliver No. 9 remained in production through 1922 and was equipped with certain bells and whistles that its earlier predecessors lacked, but its makers never deviated too far from the original design first drawn up by the company's founder Thomas Oliver way back in 1894. The Oliver design remained unique, bearing no resemblance to any of the competing typewriters of the day. While the Underwood, Royal, Remington, and Woodstock produced cookie-cutter jet black boxes that stuck to a standard of simple sophistication, the Oliver was bold, aggressive, and a tad flamboyant. Most models were painted a deep olive green and sported hexagonal keys, curved muscular plating, flared side handles, and that most significant of all features and innovations, the U-shaped, down-striking type bars, also known as batwings. The typewriter weighed in at about 30 pounds. Our first typewriter in the collection was the typewriter used by Daniel Carter Beard. Beard was a well-known author and illustrator, along with being one of the founders of the BSA. Some of his books, such as the American Boy's Book of Camp Lore and Woodcraft, are still in print and can be purchased through the museum gift shop. It's highly likely that this typewriter was the one he used to write this and other books that helped shape and guide young men and women in the early days of scouting. Our second typewriter was used by the first Chief Scout Executive, James E. West, in his office in New York City. While most of his letters and correspondence were likely typed by his secretary, it's reasonable to believe that this typewriter was used to type out documents like the 1912 Scout Handbook and many other publications that West authored while with the BSA. While typewriters have been pushed out of our daily life, they continue to be used by some government agencies and other institutions. A niche market for typewriters exists due to the regulations of many correctional systems in the United States, where prisoners are prohibited from having computers or other telecommunications equipment, but are allowed to own a typewriter. In 2011, one company was still manufacturing a clear plastic typewriter for use in prisons. The clear plastic shell made it harder for inmates to hide prohibited items inside it. In Latin America and Africa, mechanical typewriters are still common because they can be used without electrical power. In Latin America, the typewriters used are most often Brazilian models, and the early 21st century saw a revival of interest in typewriters among certain subcultures, including manufacturers themselves, steampunks, hipsters, and street poets. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of the Boy Scouts of America through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.